right? Simple. But what I'm getting at is David didn't go to Saul and be like, hey, you know what? Let's pray for Goliath so we can change his mind. You know, hey, let's maybe we should talk to him. Maybe he's not a bad person. Maybe let's fast for him. No, he went and killed him. It's just straight out. Hey, this guy, he's confronting us. And he went and what did he do? He cut off his head. Obviously he threw a rock in his head, and after that he literally cut off his head. And after he cut off his head, he picked it up and showed it to everybody. And then but David did not go pray for him. He did not, like, hey, let's fast for Goliath. Maybe he's just because he's a like the thing about like in cartoons and stuff. Usually the big strong guy is like a soft guy or something like that. There's always that thing in like cartoons, but not in this case. This guy was big and he was a menace. He was gonna kill everybody. And what I'm getting to that is that point that sometimes we have to match other people's energy in the sense that, like, if someone's being confrontational to you, be able to have your enough intelligence and enough integrity and enough character to be able to confront that person that's confronting you with the same type of, as you can say, kind of like energy. And I mean energy as in if he's being aggressive, not like energy with crystals and rocks, because like I said, there's always someone out there that's going to say something like, oh, he's talking about energy. No, I'm talking about characteristics, like as in aggressiveness, or if he's trying to be condescending, that type of energy that I mean. You have to know how to confront it, because unfortunately I feel like a lot of, and this goes for all ages, not just like young people and older people, that have, and I try the best for me personally not to be like that. But there's a lot of people out there who are scared to speak up, scared to confront, scared to speak their mind, and in the sense that it's like in a positive way, like in the in the situation that you're in. For example, let's say if you're at a workplace, and you did everything correctly, but just because someone for whatever reason doesn't like you or wants to look better than you, they'll start, maybe talking to you aggressively or trying to, belittle you in that place. And some people just kind of take it and don't say anything, right? And but I feel like at that point you should match, like I said, the energy. The swordsman, he's drawing his sword, he's attacking you. You can say so. You're not gonna be quiet and read a poem to him. No, you can also, draw your sword and face him. And that's what I mean in that sense, is that you match the same energy. And there's a lot of people that don't do that nowadays. Especially at work, I have a lot of conversations with like older people, and they're like in situations. I'm like, why don't you like speak about it? Why don't you open your mind and maybe confront the situation instead of backing down? And I don't know why, but there's a lot of people that don't do that. They're scared of the outcome, or they're scared of what they're going to say or what they're going to think of them, or maybe they're going to get singled out. But for whatever reason, they don't draw their sword. What I mean, they don't draw their sword. They don't confront the situation. And I've heard of many other like relationships or in school where it's the problem, but instead of you talking about it or confronting it, you just back away and you just let it continue. And as we can see, that usually if you don't confront a problem, what happens? The problem gets worse, or it snowballs. It just gets bigger when you could have completely avoided it in a different situation if you would have confronted it. I feel like, especially, that's a very common thing, especially with guys. Being able to be the one in the front that confronts and actually puts forward, like steps forward and faces the situation. And there's a lot of guys out there that don't really do that as much. Very timid, or I don't know what's the issue. But there's for some reason there's been a lot of guys that are like that. And like I said, it goes with all ages. From what I've talked to and people that have told me that they find themselves in a situation where you could have easily either avoided it by talking about it and confronting it, and but instead you kind of play with it. You kind of like, oh, let me try this way, let me try that way. Kind of like going back to what I said with King David. He didn't, when he heard that there was a problem, because he wasn't there about the problem. He showed up to bring some meal preps to his brothers. He went to go bring some food to his brothers, and in the process, he heard the commotion, and then that's where he confronted Goliath, killed him, cut off his head, and something as he attacked it. He went directly towards it. He confronted the problem. And like I said, he didn't pray about it. Like, oh, let's everybody get together, let's pray for Goliath. Maybe he'll change his heart. Like no, he just killed him. And I feel like there's times where we gotta do that too, where we gotta, and like I said, it comes with intelligence and be able to read the room, as we say, because I'm not also saying that, every problem you're gonna go all, guns blazing, like I'm not saying that either. Like I said, I gotta also explain that because like, oh, he said to confront the problem, just go for it, draw your sword, and maybe you were late, and the managers are like, hey, you were late, why? Like we're not saying to do that either, do it with with intelligence, like because yeah, like I said, someone out there's brain's not wired properly, so they're gonna do something like that. But confront the situation, read the room, read the environment. Hey, is this the appropriate time to confront or to talk to this person? Maybe if something that bothers you, set them aside and be like, hey, you were talking about this earlier, and you mentioned this and that, and that's incorrect. This is what really happened. But at least doing it, doing something about it. Kind of like, and if you want to get into the more, I guess, physical way, if someone breaks in your house, what are you gonna do? You're gonna try the best you can to protect and defend your family. You're not gonna just let the guy come in. It's like, well, maybe he's not gonna harm us, or maybe he's just like, no, man, you're gonna protect your family. So, but like I said, you gotta also know how to do it. Especially people have a little bit more idea of like when it comes to home defense and defense in general. Like if someone breaks in, you're not just gonna be, let's say if you're using deadly force, you're not going to be just shooting randomly. No, you're going to try to avoid collateral damage, especially with your family. Try to first make sure your family is at a harm's way, and instead of confronting the guy and causing more damage than what you are. Being able to read the room, be able to understand what's going on at that moment, not just act like I said, without any clear understanding of what the situation is. And like I said, it goes back to the thing where the situations that we find ourselves in, we got to be able to first understand them and read through them and be able to, but at the end, you always confront them. I know sometimes, like I said, it might not be the appropriate time, and you might have to wait maybe a day or so, or maybe a week, 'cause, depending on the situation, depending of, all those things. But the fact is that you do it at the end. You confront them regardless. Kind of like, in a sense, kind of like with David, after he heard that Goliath was doing all this, what did the King Saul try to do? Give him his armor. He tried to kind of like, hey, well, if you're going to do this, here's some armor, even though the armor didn't fit him. But he kind of, tried to find a way to, confront him in a certain way, like with armor and stuff, even though at the end it didn't work. But that still didn't stop him from confronting the situation. Even though, the armor didn't fit, and he was going to be alone, he tried to you can kind of say, find different ways to confront it, even though those ways didn't work at that time, but he still did it at the end. He still confronted the situation at the end, and he prevailed. So I think that's what a lot of us gotta do, is confront the situation, be able to understand it, though, be able to read the room, as I say, being able to, like I said, be able to distinguish when a swordsman draws his sword. Do not read him a poem, draw your sword as well, because he's there to confront you. He's not there to read you a poem. He's there to confront you, and you be able to match that, like I said, that energy, and be able to defend yourself in a sense. And then a lot of people that don't defend themselves end up always being like what would you call it, like a floor mat, where everyone's just stepping on, walking all over you, and you have no voice, you have no sense of any dignity, pretty much. Because, at the end of the day, all of us, one way or another, no one knows the time, but, we're going to die. And it's going to be pretty sad knowing how, like, there's people that he passed away. And it's like, oh, I didn't even know he passed away. Because you were unfortunately, you didn't have a voice. So you weren't able to, like, really give yourself any sort of presentation or anything. So people will not really, take too much of acknowledgement of who this person was or who you were. And because you were too scared of confronting, you were too scared of being outspoken, you were too scared to not saying what was on your mind. But like I said, doing everything in situational awareness. Because we all know people that maybe you're having a conversation and you speak your mind out, but sometimes it's inappropriate, or it's not at the right time, or you don't choose your words as they say carefully, and you end up causing more damage than what you really should have. So being able to also understand and read the room, because like I said, going back to that phrase about the swordsman, I mean, be able to identify that he is a swordsman from the start. That's also, a part of confronting the situation, knowing that at this moment you're going to confront something, not that this person is just going to be your friend. And like I think I was talking to you guys about last week about with the analogy with the umbrella, how sometimes we're going to be used, but as long as we know that we have a purpose, purpose, and make sure you read the situation, read them. I know I kind of repeat that a lot because I feel like that's kind of something that I've seen a lot with people do, is that they don't understand the situation they're in. It's like, you are, for example, someone that I know, got a car, and then for some reason they're like, well, I'm gonna get another one now. I was like, why? Like, you already have a mortgage. You're paying this new payment for this car. Why are you gonna get out another one? It's like, well, because I got a $5 raise, so I know I could afford it. And well, they did get out another car. And then that was a few months ago, and now he was kind of talking to me, and he was like, oh man, I got to pay this mortgage, and I got to pay these two other car bills. And then I'm all like, well, you knew that wasn't the best decision, He's like, yeah, but I mean, it felt like right because I got a raise, I deserve. And it's like, well, yeah, but you executed this decision in a poorly manner. You should have. I mean, did you even need a new car? He's like, no. Well, why'd you get it? He's like, well, because I wanted it. And so, that's not really being aware of the situation you're in. I mean, like I said, you could be confident in the sense that, oh yeah, I got a raise and I'm able to afford it, but you don't take a deeper dive in your financial situation by doing, like I said, the accountability of like the numbers. Like, okay, I'm paying this much for this much for that. And I'm pretty sure the ones that we've been here, what was it, like a couple months ago, for every Monday, my dad was talking about how we need to take better control of our finances and be able to understand our finances. Hopefully, I mean, I know a lot of us still don't have crazy big bills or anything like that, but at least being able to get a head start on that and not be able to not do the same bad decisions that some people that we know end up doing it. Because later on, you start seeing how, like, maybe, and using that example with the car, that brings like family issues, because then that brings up like maybe, let's say if they're having struggling paying for those cars now, and now the couple is going to start arguing, well, we don't have money for this, we don't have money for that, but you wanted the new cars. And no, I never said I wanted it, I just said that I like to have a new one. That doesn't mean that I wanted it. He's like, well, you should have said that from the start, and then it starts getting into problems, and then the children start seeing the bickering, the fighting. And so, it just becomes a bigger problem when you could have first read the situation first, And that's just something that's very avoidable. But, there's also different types of confrontations, like I said, it could be from someone robbing your home, attacking your home. It could be from someone talking to you in a way that makes you feel insecure, And like I said, it could be in relationships, you can be in a relationship, and let's say, you're having an issue with something, and instead of confronting it, and this person is just going to keep on doing it. Why? Because maybe they're doing it unintentionally, but if you never step up for yourself and discuss the situation, like, hey, I don't like the way you approach this, it's never going to get fixed. Because I mean, other than the other person not being aware that there's an actual problem, I mean, you're also too scared to confront it. But being able to also identify the problem, because there's a lot of people out there who blindly, they're like, oh, that's not a problem, it's not a problem. But everyone around you sees it or might be mentioning to you like, hey, like, it is a problem because, this is, from our perspective, this is how it looks like. Maybe from your point of view, it doesn't look like that. But, from like a bigger perspective, it's actually not good. And you should, confront it and face it. And, you fall into another blindly trust, because there's trust, but there's also blind loyalty. Where just because you're so used to an individual, or just because you are comfortable around an individual, but that doesn't mean that if there's something going wrong, you shouldn't confront it. And if anything, if you do have that loyalty and you do have that comfortability with that person, you should even have better, it should be easier for you to be able to confront this person because you have that. So that already is indication that there's something wrong, because from the start, you're already having a fear of confronting the situation. You guys kind of know what I mean? Yes? No? I mean, Yeah, right. Okay, cool. Because I know it might sound a little complicated, but it's not. Like I said, sometimes I don't want to break it down too much. Like if I explain, I mean, I'm gonna be breaking it down right now, but if I tell you guys, hey, a car needs a tire, but there's gonna be somewhere out there, yeah, but you also need the rim and the lug nuts. I was like, yeah, I know that goes without saying. You know, you also need a car for so, but there's people out there like that. That's why I always say that because when I'm talking to people, there's people that always I don't know. They just, and I'm pretty sure you guys find yourself in those situations too when you're trying to explain something. And that's another thing too. Maybe at that situation, you need patience, let's say. And that's something that I've definitely worked on a lot because, I mean, especially where you work or if you go to school, patience is a very hard thing to do at times, It really is, especially when, okay, I'll give you my story for that happened to me this past week. So where I work, we usually, when everyone leaves passing the metal detector, they show us their bags to see if they didn't steal anything. And it's every day is the same thing. It's like clockwork. Every day is the same thing. But for some reason, and these are all adults, people that are older than me sometimes. And you would think, every day is the same thing. You should get the idea that before you get to the metal detector, you open up your bag, we peek inside, and then that's it. But sometimes some people are like, "Oh, are you gonna check today?" And it's like, "Yeah, we check every day. It's the same thing." Yeah. But then there's this one lady who, well, actually, watch. Let me give you a big scenario because it has a lot to do with what I was saying about reading the room, reading the situation, and be able to execute properly. So everybody left at the same time for some reason. So there was a big line, and usually most part is pretty good at showing us their bags. And these two older ladies, they have the clear bags, so it's really they just pop it, they just show it in front of us, and it's clear, so we can see inside. But there was like a long line, and one of the older ladies, she had like a cooler, and she always shows me the cooler, just a bunch of drinks. So because there was a long line and there was people waiting, she showed us a bag, and she was gonna pick up the cooler and open it. I was like, no, you're good. Like, there's a long line, there's people coming in, reading the room. Yeah, go through. Common sense. And after I did that, there was like these other lady like behind her, and she was like, "Whoa!" And she just passed by, and I was like, "Hey, open your bag." And she was like, "Oh yeah, but you didn't have hers. You didn't have her open her cooler." I was like, "Oh my god!" So I was like, "Who?" She was like, "Yeah, that." And I knew who it was, but she was like, "Yeah, that lady. You didn't tell her to open her cooler. Why are you telling me to open up my bag?" And I was like, "Oh." And I was like, "Well, let's go tell her. Come on." And she was like, "Oh no, I'm not gonna tell." I was like, "No, come on, let's go tell her. Since you're very, confronting about this, like you want to play this out, you want to play this whole thing out. Let's play it out how you want it." So I went with the lady, and she didn't know what to say after that. She was like, "Oh," and I was like, "No, come on, like you wanted us to confront this. Let's confront it together, And she was like, "Oh no," and then I still went up there and I told the lady, "Hey, open your cooler," but she was like, "Oh yeah," she was cool about it. She opened it. And then one of the older ladies, she was like, "¿Quién chismeó? ¿Quién dijo? ¿Quién?" And then I was like, "Hey, I'm just saying that someone said." And then that same lady that told me, she was passing by, and the other lady's like, "It was her, fue ella." And then, so I was like, and then the lady looked at me, and I was like, "Hey, you're the one that, spoke this into action." And the other lady's like, "It was her, it was her." So everyone was just pointing at her, and then the lady just started running to her car, and I was like, "Dude, like, you did this to yourself, and then I told the lady, I was like, "Nah, you guys are good. Like, I already know." Like, and she was like, "No, okay." But at the end of the day, it was kind of like, okay, you know that every day you do the same thing, so why make it worse? Like, why complicate it more? And then the fact that you were very confronting about something, and I was like, okay, let's face it. You told me that this individual didn't open up. Let's go. Come on, we'll check it if you really want that. And at the end, you got scared, and she didn't want to do it. She just stayed back. And it was just worse because at the end she got called out, and it just ended up being worse for her. Going back to what I was saying about how be able to read the room, the situation, hey, it's busy. There's people going through, I'm not going to have people wait in line for something so simple that is not really a big deal. But someone out there always, makes things worse or, makes situations worse than what they are. And if she would have just had her bag opened before the metal detector, I wouldn't even bother her with anything, and she wouldn't have to make a comment because her bag would have already been open. So you know how there's, and that's just something at work that's so simple, but you know how like it always explodes, and it could, and you guys can, I'm pretty sure, picture a lot of situations that you guys have had where things could have been avoided, things could have been better planned, but just because someone wants to, I don't know, act out or have the be that person that's like, oh well, it's my word against theirs type of thing. There's always some ego out there that wants to prove themselves, and unfortunately, for the most part, that always fails because as we know that the Bible says that the fall comes after when your ego is uplifted. So we gotta also try to be careful with that. Even with myself, I always try to be careful with that. I'm not Mr. Know-it-all. I try to know everything, but I do at least try to read a room. At least I try to understand the situation, see people's behaviors, and do things like that before I act. Because, that's a sense of understanding and, in the sense maturity and being able to, read the room, the situation, I'm pretty sure you guys can kind of understand how maybe sometimes during the service, maybe my dad's talking about something and you hear like a comment out in the crowd and you're kind of like, maybe that's not the right comment to say or not the right time to say that. But, at that time, that individual didn't think it through and just blurted it out, So being able to, and that's just like a simple example you guys can probably see here on Sundays or during church days. But, put that in a bigger perspective, put that in a bigger understanding of how there's some situations where are very difficult, and be able to, like I said, not just understand the situation, but be able also to confront the situation. And understanding the situation gives you a better interpretation of how to confront the situation. And you guys know what I mean. Seeing the problem first, taking your time, and then approach the problem. Don't just, like I said, going back to the analogy. First you have to understand that you're facing a swordsman, and then knowing that the swordsman draws his sword, then you draw your sword because you already understand and identified that this person in front of you, it's a swordsman. It's not a poet that you're going to read a poem to. You guys kind of catch my drift? Yeah. So hopefully with these, I've been looking at a lot of analogies and stuff like that. And of course, going back to the Psalms, where it said, you train my hands and prepare my fingers for battle. And we could have put that into like the swordsmanship, but also, prepare my hands in the sense of the situation. Hey, if I'm having trouble with this relationship, prepare my hands, read, pray, fast, prepare yourself, you pray to God to help you understand the situation you're falling into, and be able to attack it, prepare my fingers for battle, being able to confront the situation, like I said, there's many different kinds of situations. There's some that are very simple to solve, but, depending on what level you are, as in your age and all that stuff, it comes in different variations. But overall, being able to, understand and know that God has our backs at the end of the day. If we fall into Him, if we pray, if we read His Word, a lot of the answers or a lot of situations that we find ourselves in, maybe not like word for word or idea by idea, but there's a lot of situations that are in the Bible, stories, for example, the one with David, perfect example of how him saw a problem, try to find a way to fix a problem in the sense of, the king trying to give him the armor and stuff, knowing that wasn't going to work, but at the end he still confronted it and, and faced it. The simple story is that, but also we can also go back with King David, how when he fell with, with lust, we can see how a lot of those situations also, and at the end, ended up being bad for him with his whole family, his sons and everything. So that's another situation that we can think of ourselves, even with King Saul, who started getting mad because everyone was saying, Saul has killed his 1,000 and David is 10,000. He started getting jealous. That's a story of jealousy. I'm pretty sure, you guys understand or know people, or even yourselves that find yourself where you feel jealous of someone or something. And it's not even because it's something like good, but it's just because you're just feeling that jealousy, because there's also good type of jealous, jealous for reading the word, jealous for praying and to being more intimate with God. That's a good type of jealous that you feel, but not the one like, for example, with King Saul, who was starting to feel jealous because people were giving David more praises at the end. So, you know, there's a lot of situations that we might find ourselves that maybe, like I said, the stories are not word for word in the Bible, but there's a lot of stories that have the same similar feelings, the same similar actions, the same similar, in a way, outcomes, you know, that we can put ourselves in. And I think by how I read in Psalms, how, you know, train my hands, as in, you know, help me read, you know, pray, fast, you know, come to church, be present, not just, you know, being here and how they say in Spanish, nomás calentando asiento, you know, actually be here and, you know, pay attention and listen. Because, I mean, we've all been there where, you know, we're kind of falling asleep or we drift away and we're not paying attention. You know, that's happened to all of us. Kind of how my dad was saying earlier that when the guy was playing that one song, and actually it was the other way around, just to clarify. I was already in there and I was already sick. I left because I wanted to throw up. That's why I left. So it was the other way around. But I was there when the guy was playing the song, yeah, and then he had a purple shirt. It was funny, yeah, he had a purple shirt. And I think the guitar was purple too, and his shirt was kind of like unbuttoned, so he had like yeah, it was completely. But it was. I do remember that though, because even I was kind of dumbfounded, like, what's going on here, like. And I remember for many months after, we would always tell Oscar, and we would always laugh about it, like, hey, remember that one guy? But yeah, I was already sick, and then I left. Not the other way around. Not that I was sick and then I went in there. It was the other way around. Just to clarify it. See, that's me confronting the situation. I just did it. Yeah, but I remember that time. Yeah, but you know, hopefully, you know, when you go out there in the real world, as we say, you know, you'll be able to find yourself in situations. And I think a good idea is you can either think about the analogy, or you can just simply think about King David, of him seeing a problem and just simply confronting it. Like I said, he didn't tell, hey, you know what, it's, and I'm not saying to not pray or to, you know, breaking it down again. And I'm not saying to not pray or to not fast or to not, you know, talk to the pastor about it. I'm not saying not to do anything of that, but, you know, do as much as you can. But at the end of the day, confront the situation. And then there, like I said, there might be, depends on the situation, depends on the levels. You might need to confront that situation at that moment, you know. Maybe at that exact moment, you might need to confront that. And that's where I'm saying that don't be scared about doing it. You know, do it, confront it. I know a lot of us sometimes get scared to, like, you know, speak. You know, I know especially, I mean, I feel like for guys, it really shouldn't be a problem. You know, I feel like it shouldn't, like being outspoken, speaking out, but, you know, sometimes it is. And of course, we know that, you know, for girls, you know, a little bit more shy, more timid. And I can understand how it could be a little bit harder to, you know, be at that moment, like, confront it. But, you know, everyone's different. And, you know, there's some girls that I know that they'll tell you straight right there and there. And, you know, that's fine. You know, but there's some of you guys that, you know, might be a little bit more timid and shy. But that shouldn't give you a reason not to confront it at the end, you know? That shouldn't give you a reason not to be able to, you know, point it out or single it out or let the other individual know. Because, I mean, I know it could be hard sometimes. I know I told you guys about a story a while back about a friend who, she's very shy, and how she couldn't ask for a job. And she would ask, I said this a while back, and how she told me, like, hey, go get the application. I was like, I'll get you the application, but for the interview and for all that, you got to talk. Like, you know, I'm not going to be able to go with the interview for you. And, like, no, you got to talk. And like how I said at the end, yeah, she did get a job, but since she was having trouble with learning. It was at a restaurant. She had trouble learning the system or something like that. And instead of her asking for help or trying to get it right, she just quit. So it's kind of, it's kind of sad. But that's an individual that I can see that, like, you know, she didn't know how to confront a situation. She had help. A lot of the friends and stuff helped her, but she still wouldn't come to her senses of being able to confront. And, you know, at the end, you know, she just quit her job because she couldn't ask for help, you know. And that's pretty bad if you think about it. And that's just something as simple as a job. But imagine, well, I don't want to, I mean, actually, it's kind of sad. But, yeah, she, well, actually, I'll say it. But for her job, yeah, she quit because she couldn't get help. Or she didn't want to ask for help. She got into this relationship where I guess the guy was being abusive and stuff like that. But she wouldn't ask for help. Like, she would tell us and be like, well, you got to do something, say something. no, I can't say anything. I don't know what he's gonna say. I don't know what he's gonna do. It's like, come on, like you're getting abused here. Like you gotta say something. Well, to this day, she's still in that abusive relationship, physically and everything, and she hasn't been able to speak about. Or we all know that's going to happen. That's happening. I mean, I don't really associate myself with her anymore, but we like from people that we know that she's still going through all that, and she still hasn't been able to confront the problem. So you know how a problem of not being able to confront something as simple as asking for a job application and not being able to learn or to improve from it, in the long run, it leads to an abusive relationship that she can't even find herself to get out of. And anybody would think like, well, this person's crazy. Like, how do you not get out of something like that? But just because that feeling of confrontation or that feeling of fear stayed in there, it's been many years and still hasn't been able to get out of it. And now, unfortunately, it doesn't really, it's not really in the best position. So, like I said, being able to face a situation, and like I keep on repeating, depending on the situation you're in, doesn't matter how big or how small. In the long run, if you don't get into that habit of confronting, if you don't get into that habit of being outspoken, you're gonna never do it, and in the long run you're gonna be pretty miserable, in a sense. And like I said, me being able to see it and hear from it, and it's unfortunate, it's really unfortunate, because you do have, like right now, I'm telling you, so I'm trying to give you that idea in your minds that like, hey, yeah, I need to confront it, and I need to face my fears, type of thing. I need to do this. So like later on when you get older, you're not like, well, no one told me, no one told me, no one advised me, or no one was there for me. Like, no, right now, with all of us, not just me, but everybody within here, you guys can ask each other, you guys can help each other, and being able to, have each other's backs, because, we know it's how the real world out there is, it's a, what do you say, is a dog eat world, or how do you say that? Yeah, it's tough, it's really tough. And like I said, maybe in school, the ones that are still going to school, you guys might be getting an idea of that, how people are and stuff like that. But once you get older, you start confronting with people. Like, for example, if you start a job, you're not gonna be when you start that job, you're not gonna be working with people your age. You're gonna be working with people that are way older. You're gonna be working with people that have had different types of problems. So you're not just gonna be like in school. You kind of have an idea of who people are around you are, their age, and kind of like everybody has like the same similar problems, like with school and tests and stuff like that. So you guys can all what's that word called? Relate. You guys can all relate to each other in a sense. Obviously, not exactly, but in a sense, when you start getting to a job, you're going to be with people that are, like I said, older, younger, people that have families, people that have never had families, people who were once addicts, who are addicts. You're going to be filled with all this new type of people, and you're going to be confronting with all these type of people, And like I said, depending on what situation you're in, the whole point is to be able to confront it, be able to face your fear and speak out. Hey, you know what? Or sometimes, just to kind of finish up, you might be in a position where it's not even that bad, but at the same time, it's not also helping you. For example, you might be at a job, right? And you've already reached the limit. You're not gonna get paid more. You're not gonna get more hours. You've kind of, especially if we're young. Especially if you're young, and just because you're comfortable there, you're kind of like, well, I'll just stay here, like whatever. But if you don't confront it, like, you know what, like I'm not getting any better here. You need to confront it in yourself and get something better, because at the end of the day, you're not gonna progress. Now, if you're doing something on the side, that's a different story. But not just being going back to what I'm saying, not confronting something bad, like someone at that moment, yelling at you or something, but just because you're in a comfortable environment and you're kind of scared to get out of that comfortable environment, you'd also got to face that. It's a different type of facing, you can say, not like a direct one, but like being able to read, like I said, the room, your personal situation, understand it, and confronting it in a sense like, I need to do something better. So, like I said, there's different types of confrontations, but as long as you do it, I feel like that's kind of like the point, is that as long as you do it. David saw Goliath, he killed him and cut off his head. Simple as that. There's no other story in the Bible where it says, oh, you know what, David felt bad for Goliath. What if he had his family? his son was not going to see him again. You know, Daddy's going to war. Nah, that dude got his head cut off. You know, like he's gone. You know, like David didn't think about that. You know, because there was a problem right there, and you know, obviously, you know, we can get more into the lore of, you know, the story with David and Goliath, but the whole point is that David saw the problem. He confronted it. Right. He didn't really wait for anything else. He didn't think about it too much. No, he wasn't, oh, maybe I'll come back tomorrow, you know? He didn't say that either, like, oh, yeah, I'll come back tomorrow. I'll come back next week, you know? Maybe Goliath might be more tired, or, you know, maybe he's not in the mood. You know, no, he didn't do any of that. He saw the problem, he confronted it, and that was the end of that. Simple as that, you know? Poor Goliath, you know, he didn't stand a chance, you know? He was just there he was just trying to do his job, man, you know? He was just a soldier. He was just following orders. He was just doing his job. But, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, you know, it's kind of funny, but, you know, David just simply killed him. So, like, you know, to conclude, if you see a situation, if you see a problem, understand the situation and confront it, you know? Like, just confront it, you know, like I said. And if you need help with something, you know, ask for help. You know, there's people around you, your parents, you know, pastors, you know, there's people there to help you. You know, just simply ask for help. If you don't understand or you find it hard to understand, just ask for help. But at the end of the day, confront it. You know, confront it, face it, and as they say, the truth will set you free. You know, so we can stand up and do a quick prayer. Thank you, God, for this blessed day. Thank you for being able to be with us and be able to listen to your word in the morning.